So the idea was, you guys did a great assembly about internationalism.
Oh, that was us. Yeah, not
which was
Britain.
fantastic. But it made me think about what are the steps between your national identity and like being connected to the people around you and your family and internationalism. Feeling like you were connected to the rest of the people around the world and having respect for them and trying to learn and understand different groups of people. So I want to tell a little bit of a story to try and link those two things together and introduce you to the Sundalandians. Duck, you are a Sundalandian.
Yes.
Behind the camera, by the way. Sundalandians, these are people. The place they come from is Sundaland. And I don't mean Sundaland, no Mackems, Sundaland, not Sundaland. And so, in order to tell the story of Sundaland, we have to go back in time a little bit, and we've got to zoom out. So, today, this is Indonesia, and at the very south of Indonesia. By the way, Indonesia is enormous. You know, one end of Indonesia to the other is like the equivalent of London to Iraq, Baghdad in Iraq. It's enormous, Indonesia. It stretches so far. Today, the thing I'm interested in is this place called Gunung Padang. Gunung Padang. It's this great big pyramid. It often gets called the oldest pyramid in the world. It's not really a pyramid, it's actually more like an ancient volcano, what remains of an ancient volcano. And people started to investigate this thing about 100 years ago, and when they did, they thought it was interesting. They found these great big stones. They didn't really know what they were. They thought they were maybe about 1,000 years old, and then people forgot about it. They weren't interested enough. In 2010, people got a lot more interested. And they found that even though most of the big stones that were on this great big hill were volcanic basalt, so they were natural in origin, the way they'd been placed and moved around seemed to suggest that there was some kind of settlement there that was much older. And this guy called Danny Hillman, he dug into the ground, started to dig really deep, took some samples, and he carbon dated the samples, and he found that some of them were 25,000 years old. And so, even though some people say that can't be right, this can't work, it goes against the consensus. For the first time, some people say maybe humans had actually lived here and developed societies here 25,000 years ago. Old and interesting. But still, we're talking about natural structures which were used by humans to make something. It's interesting, we've not found many artifacts. So, instead, let's go and have a look at Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is in southern Anatolia in Turkey. And I think it's just the most amazing, amazing place on the planet. Göbekli Tepe is filled with these huge, look at the size of the people here compared to the stone, huge T-shaped pillars. And they are made to look like people, standing with their arms by their sides, wearing belts. But they're in this circular formation. They've got carvings in high relief of different animals that don't live in Turkey today, but did in the past. People made these as a whole religious structure, religious settlement of different stone circles over a great distance. And then they filled it in. They filled these with stone. And we did carbon dating on this, and we found out that it's 12,000 years old. That means that this was built, and humans did this before they'd even developed farming, before the Neolithic agricultural revolution, before they domesticated pigs. They built this. It puts the clock back on our understanding of history by at least 4,000 years. So I think this is the most amazing place in the world, and it probably looked something like this. Today this region is a desert, but back 12,000 years ago when all this was being constructed, it wouldn't have been. It would have been like grassland and savanna. It would have been full of life, full of different wild animals that we don't have today. Anyway, both of these places, had they been inhabited by humans at that time, were around during, more or less, what was an ice age. A time when London was under 2 kilometers of ice. New York would have been under 3 kilometers of ice. Imagine that, 2 kilometers of ice. That's the equivalent of what covers Antarctica today. and then it melted, and the world changed. But when it wasn't melted, and when all the ice covered the world, and when people lived at Göbekli Tepe and other places, the world would have looked a little bit like this, and sea levels were about 120 meters lower than they are today. So we can see that the Persian Gulf, parts of the Mediterranean Sea, Britain, Florida here, lots of these coastlines look a lot different. The land around the world was different. And here in Southeast Asia, most of the landmass was connected in what's called Sundaland. This is called the Sunda Shelf. It's a continent on its own, really. Today, it's underwater, but back then it wasn't. And all of this, certainly down here, from right up around Guangzhou, Hong Kong, right down, in fact, even as far as Korea, but down to the very southern area of Indonesia today, this would have been covered by a great rainforest, a huge rainforest. It would have been filled with elephants and rhinos and tigers. It would have been bustling with life. And the people who lived there, they would have had a common culture. They would have had a common lifestyle because they lived in a common environment. They would have done similar things and spoken similar languages. They would have been connected. And so we can start to say that the people who lived here had some kind of a common identity. The people of Sundaland were Sundalandians. And when those ice sheets started to melt, the sea level rises up again, and we get the Southeast Asia we have today. But there are still people across this area with a common origin and a common identity. Even, again, as far as Korea now, we look at genetic evidence and we find that the Korean people probably, maybe around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, came from Southeast Asia. When all of this started to flood, people moved out of the area to live along the coastal plains all the way up Asia and spread. So we can say that the Sundalandians are in many ways a common people with a common origin. And back in 1967, people started to remember this. And ASEAN was created. And all of these countries decided, yeah, we do have a lot more in common than we have as differences, and maybe we should work together. So when you think about internationalism, there is a step in between where you come from, your country, your local identity, your global identity, and maybe your regional identity. And I'm very interested to know, people in Vietnam at least, what do you think about this? Do you think it's useful to be known as a Sundalandian? Do you think that you should be considered one? Do you think it's helpful when you think about internationalism to also think about regionalism, regional identity? Or is actually this creating too many boundaries between people? But anyway, Sundalandians, that's what I think you are, and I think it's something that we should learn more about, because the people of Sundaland who lived in here, everything that they've left behind is now 120 meters under the sea. Nobody is doing archaeology there, and actually we don't know just how these people lived and what they left behind. And I hope future archaeologists will find a way to look at this more closely and understand how significant this area and these people were.